In the summer of 1983, anthropologist Dr. Farid Alam shouldered his weathered leather satchel and began the treacherous climb into Pakistan's Hindu Kush mountains, his breath forming silver clouds in the thin mountain air. The government census department had dispatched him on what appeared to be routine bureaucratic work, counting heads in remote villages that existed more in rumor than in official records. The narrow trail snaked through pine forests so dense that ancient sunlight filtered down and scattered coins of gold, while the silence pressed against his ears like velvet. Each step higher made his lungs burn as oxygen grew scarce, and loose shale threatened to send him tumbling into gorges that disappeared into blue-black shadows thousands of feet below. What Dr. Alam discovered in those hidden valleys would haunt his dreams and reshape his understanding of human survival for the rest of his career. Nestled between peaks that seemed to scrape holes in the sky itself lived just 4,000 Kalash people, the last surviving practitioners of an ancient pagan faith that had somehow endured while the great empires of Alexander, the Mughals, and the British rose and crumbled around them like sandcastles before an eternal tide. Their festivals blazed with colors that seemed borrowed from paradise itself. Women in black robes embroidered with geometric patterns that told stories of gods and heroes, their headdresses dripping with cowrie shells and silver coins that caught firelight and threw it back like captured stars. Their cedar shrines echoed with songs so ancient that linguistic scholars could trace their roots back to proto-Indo-European languages spoken when the pyramids were still young. Their rituals involved blood sacrifices and ecstatic dancing that connected them directly to deities their ancestors had worshipped when these same mountain passes witnessed Alexander's armies struggling through snow and ice, when Buddhist monks carved temples into cliffsides, when Mongol raiders swept through valleys leaving nothing but ash and memories. But beneath the vibrant surface of their cultural celebrations, beneath the laughter of children playing ancient games and the chanting of elders who could recite genealogies stretching back 20 generations, Dr. Alam noticed something that chilled him more than a mountain wind. The community's bloodlines were quietly vanishing, generation by generation, like a river slowly drying up under an invisible sun. The numbers in his leather-bound notebooks told a story of gradual extinction that no amount of ritual devotion, no prayers to mountain gods, no festivals bright enough to be seen from orbiting satellites could reverse through faith alone. Before we continue with the extraordinary story of the Kalash and their desperate struggle against genetic extinction, a battle fought not with swords or guns, but with marriage customs and DNA samples, with ancient wisdom and modern science, with a terrible choice between cultural purity and biological survival. Make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. These hidden histories didn't happen in some distant, mythical land populated by characters from fairy tales. They happen in communities just like yours, where real people with real families face impossible choices between honoring the spirits of their ancestors and ensuring their children would have any future at all. The Kalash homeland consists of 3 narrow valleys carved deep into the Hindu Kush like wounds in the earth's flesh: Bumberet, Rumber, and Byrer. Each valley is a world complete unto itself, accessible only by footpaths that cling to cliffsides like spider webs spun by God with vertigo. During winter months, heavy snows seal these communities off from the outside world so completely that families must survive for 4 or 5 months on stored grain, dried fruit, and the milk of goats tough enough to forage on slopes that would challenge mountain climbers equipped with modern gear. This isolation, which might seem like a curse to outsiders accustomed to grocery stores and emergency rooms, had actually served as a Kalash's salvation for over 2,000 years. Cut off from the great currents of historical change that swept across Central Asia like successive tsunamis, they preserved traditions that vanished elsewhere when conquering armies demanded conversion to Islam, Christianity, or Buddhism. Their villages, built of stone and cedar wood that could withstand avalanches and earthquakes, seemed to grow from the mountainsides themselves like some form of architectural lichen. Their daily life revolved around an intricate dance with a mountain environment that required knowledge passed down through bloodlines like precious heirlooms. Men tended herds of goats whose milk sustained entire families through winters so harsh that temperatures could drop to 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, while women cultivated terrace fields of barley, wheat, and millet that climbed mountainsides in geometric patterns visible from neighboring peaks 20 miles away. Every significant location in their territory, from freshwater springs that never froze to ancient oak groves where their ancestors had carved initials in scripts no scholar could decipher, hosted cedar shrines decorated with carved horses, ibex, and human figures engaged in activities that anthropologists could only guess at. Their polytheistic faith centered around a complex pantheon that made Greek mythology look simple by comparison. The Zalic governed love, reproduction, and the dangerous mysteries of female fertility. Mahandio served as creator god whose breath had formed the mountains themselves during cosmic struggles that predated human memory. Baliamane protected warriors and travelers, while Sagigor watched over craftsmen and the intricate skills required to survive in an environment that offered no margin for error. During festivals like Chilam Joshi in spring, when wildflowers carpeted valley floors in colors that seemed too intense for reality, the entire community erupted in celebration that could last for days and nights without pause. Women donned elaborate headdresses covered in cowrie shells brought from oceans thousands of miles away. Silver coins inherited from grandmothers whose own grandmothers had worn the same ornaments, and geometric embroidery that required years to complete and told stories of divine intervention in human affairs. Men competed in horse races on animals bred for stamina in thin air, archery contests where arrows had to find targets placed on cliffsides accessible only to eagles, and wrestling matches that sometimes continued until participants collapsed from exhaustion, while drums echoed through valleys that seemed designed by cosmic architects as natural amphitheaters. But by 1983, when Dr. Alam arrived with his census forms and government credentials, this ancient way of life faced pressures that threatened its very existence with the slow inexorability of climate change. Pakistan's modernization efforts brought roads closer to Kalash territory every year, making migration to cities like Peshawar and Karachi easier than walking to neighboring villages had been for previous generations. Islamic missionaries arrived with promises of education, medical care, and economic opportunity for converts willing to abandon pagan practices that their new neighbors considered not just primitive but actively blasphemous. Most troubling of all were demographic trends that no amount of traditional wisdom could explain or reverse. Birth rates that had once compensated for high infant mortality were declining as couples struggled to raise healthy children in communities where everyone seemed increasingly related to everyone else. Wedding celebrations, once monthly occurrences during favorable seasons, became rare events as young people either left for opportunities in the outside world or found themselves unable to locate suitable marriage partners within their shrinking community. Dr. Alam's census work began with the methodical cheerfulness of a man who had spent his career documenting rural Pakistani communities and expected his assignment to follow familiar patterns. He established his base camp in Bumbarat Valley, the largest and most accessible of the 3 Kalash settlements, setting up his card table and folding chair under a massive walnut tree whose trunk was so wide that 3 men holding hands couldn't encircle it. The tree had clearly served as a community gathering place for generations. Its bark bore carved initials in multiple scripts, and the ground beneath was worn smooth by countless feet. The Kalash proved remarkably cooperative with his official inquiries, even eager to share their stories with an outsider who showed genuine interest in their traditions rather than try and convert them to Islam or convince them to abandon practices that Pakistani bureaucrats often dismissed as backward superstitions. Village headmen brought him cups of tea brewed with yak butter and honey, while women offered plates of walnuts and dried mulberries that provided more nutrition than most meals he'd eaten in government hostels. But as Dr. Alam compiled his demographic data over several weeks, moving from house to house with the patient thoroughness that had made him valuable to the census department, disturbing patterns began to emerge from his carefully organized index cards. In 2 specific hamlets clustered around ancient shrines, he noticed significant gaps in age demographics that couldn't be explained by normal variations in birth timing or family planning decisions. There was a particularly stark shortage of teenage girls between 14 and 18 years old, precisely the age group that should have been preparing for marriage and starting families of their own. When he politely inquired about these missing cohorts, speaking through translators who helped him navigate the complex social protocols required for discussing family matters with strangers, village elders offered explanations that seemed plausible but left him with nagging doubts. Many young women had died during a particularly harsh winter 5 years earlier, they explained, when medical supplies couldn't reach the valleys due to avalanches that blocked mountain passes for months at a time. Others had married men from neighboring villages and moved away, following traditional customs that required wives to join their husbands' households. More troubling still was a clustering of surnames that became apparent as Dr. Alam expanded his interviews to include extended family relationships. In communities numbering only a few hundred people, he naturally expected some repetition of family names. Rural societies everywhere tend toward kinship networks that intermarry over generations. But the concentration he observed in Kalash villages suggested something far more extreme than normal endogamy. The same dozen surnames appeared repeatedly across multiple generations, creating family trees that look more like elaborate Celtic knots than the branching patterns typical of healthy populations. His growing concern crystallized into genuine alarm when he began documenting patterns of infant mortality that local midwives had been whispering about for years but had never discussed openly with outsiders. While child mortality had always been higher in mountain communities lacking modern medical facilities, Dr. Alam noticed that deaths weren't randomly distributed across families as statistical models would predict. Instead, they concentrated in certain lineages with precision that seemed to violate the laws of chance. Some extended families lost multiple babies to the same mysterious conditions: heart defects that killed infants within weeks of birth, cleft palates severe enough to prevent feeding, developmental delays that became apparent only as children failed to reach normal milestones for walking, speaking, and recognizing family members. These conditions weren't unknown in other populations, but their frequency among the Kalash, and their tendency to cluster within specific bloodlines, suggested patterns that kept Dr. Alam awake during the long mountain nights when wind howled through peaks that seemed to touch the bottom of heaven itself. The chilling question that haunted his dreams was becoming impossible to ignore. Was devotion to ancient tradition actually accelerating genetic drift that threatened the community's biological survival? Were marriage practices designed to preserve cultural and spiritual purity inadvertently, creating the conditions for genetic extinction as surely as if they had been designed by enemies who wanted to destroy the Kalash without firing a single shot? In 1994, 11 years after Dr. Alam's initial census had revealed the demographic shadows haunting Kalash valleys, fictional population geneticist Dr. Layla Qureshi arrived in a region with equipment that would have seemed like artifacts from an alien civilization to the community's founders. Her expedition included portable DNA sequencing, devices no larger than laptop computers, solar-powered workstations capable of processing genetic data in real time, and satellite communication systems that could transmit research findings to laboratories in Islamabad and London without her ever leaving the mountainside camps where she collected blood samples and recorded family histories. Dr. Qureshi's mission extended far beyond the simple head counting that had occupied her predecessor. She had come to map the genetic architecture of an isolated population that had endured centuries of extreme bottlenecks, periods when the total number of breeding individuals dropped to levels that would doom most mammalian species to extinction within a handful of generations. Her preliminary research, conducted in air-conditioned university libraries thousands of miles from the peaks where her subjects struggled to survive each winter, had identified historical events that had decimated Kalash numbers with the efficiency of natural disasters. The brutal raids of the 1890s, when neighboring Muslim armies had swept through the valleys like human tsunamis, had enslaved hundreds of Kalash women and children while killing most of the men who tried to defend them. The catastrophic famine of 1943, triggered by crop failures that coincided with particularly harsh weather patterns, had killed nearly a third of the surviving population through starvation and diseases that attacked weakened immune systems. More recently, the modernization pressures of the late 20th century continued bleeding young people away from traditional communities at rates that threatened to reduce the effective breeding population below the minimum necessary for long-term survival. Working with village elders who become cautiously supportive of scientific inquiry after seeing how Dr. Alam's earlier research had attracted government attention and modest infrastructure improvements, Dr. Qureshi began constructing detailed pedigree charts that traced family relationships back 5 generations. These genealogical maps, drawn on large sheets of paper that she spread across the floors of village meeting houses, revealed bottlenecks so severe that they violated basic principles of population genetics that graduate students learned in introductory courses. In some lineages, she could trace modern families back to single founding couples who had survived historical disasters not through any genetic advantage or superior adaptation to mountain conditions, but through sheer luck, being in the right valley when raiders struck elsewhere, having stored enough grain to survive famines that killed their neighbors. avoiding the diseases that swept through communities already weakened by malnutrition and isolation. The survivors have become involuntary founders of genetic lineages that now carry the burden of repopulating their people. Her mitochondrial DNA analysis, conducted on samples that village women provided with a mixture of curiosity and nervousness about procedures they didn't fully understand, yielded results that were even more alarming than her pedigree charts had suggested. Among Kalash women, just 3 distinct haplotypes, genetic signatures inherited exclusively through maternal line and passed unchanged from mothers to daughters across thousands of generations, accounted for approximately 80% of the population. This lack of genetic diversity was so extreme that it suggested the vast majority of modern Kalash could trace their maternal ancestry to just 3 founding mothers, probably survivors of some ancient catastrophe that wiped out most other female lineages with the thoroughness of a natural extinction event. The implications went far beyond academic curiosity or abstract concerns about genetic theory. Reduced genetic diversity made the entire Kalash population vulnerable to infectious diseases that might sweep through their valleys like wildfire, killing individuals who lacked immune system variations that would allow some members of more diverse populations to survive epidemics. It increased the probability that recessive genetic disorders would manifest in children whose parents unknowingly carried identical copies of harmful mutations inherited from common ancestors. Most ominously, it suggested that the effective breeding population, the number of individuals actually contributing genes to future generations, was far smaller than even the declining head counts would suggest. Village elders initially interpreted these scientific findings through the lens of a traditional worldview, which had served them well through centuries of persecution and hardship, the survival of their people through waves of conquest, forced conversion, natural disasters, and cultural pressure proved divine protection from their gods, who would continue watching over faithful worshippers as long as they maintained the ritual practices and social customs that had earned celestial favor. The collision between scientific evidence and traditional practice created fault lines that ran through every Kalash household like cracks in mountain stone, threatening to split families that had maintained unity through centuries of external pressure. At the center of this growing tension lay their ancient marriage customs, refined over countless generations to preserve not just bloodlines, but the spiritual purity that connected them to gods whose favor had sustained their people through persecution that would have destroyed less faithful communities. Kalash women observed elaborate menstrual taboos that required them to live in separate huts called bashali during their periods, because menstrual blood was considered spiritually contaminating in ways that could affect the entire community's relationship with divine protectors. These isolation periods, while seeming oppressive to outside observers, actually provided women with regular retreats from domestic duties and opportunities for female bonding that strengthened social networks crucial for survival in harsh mountain conditions. Marriage alliances were negotiated not simply between families seeking economic advantage or romantic satisfaction, but between entire lineages whose spiritual compatibility was judged according to complex rules about ritual cleanliness, ancestral spirits, and divine favor that required elders to consult genealogies stretching back 20 generations. These same practices that had preserved cultural identity through waves of conquest and conversion also dramatically restricted the gene pool available for each generation's reproductive choices. Young people could only marry within their own valleys, and even then, certain lineages were forbidden from intermarrying due to ancient feuds, ritual prohibitions, or spiritual incompatibilities that elders claimed could anger the gods and bring disaster upon the entire community. Girls typically married by age 16 to men chosen by their families based primarily on spiritual and social compatibility, rather than the genetic diversity that scientists increasingly recognized as essential for biological survival. The custom of levirate marriage, where widows were expected to marry their dead husband's brothers to ensure that children remained within established family structures, further concentrated genes within narrow bloodlines, while serving important social functions in communities where survival often depended on extended family cooperation. These practices made perfect sense within traditional Kalash worldview, but they created exactly the conditions that population geneticists recognized as recipes for extinction. Dr. Qureshi spent countless hours interviewing women like Bibi Noor, a 60-year-old widow whose weathered hand spoke eloquently of decades spent wresting sustenance from mountain soil that yielded crops only to those who understood its moods and seasons. Bibi Noor had buried 3 of her 7 children in infancy, losses that had carved permanent lines of grief into her face. But she explained with quiet dignity why her surviving daughters must marry their cousins to honor traditions that had protected their people when armies sought to destroy them. "The gods know every soul that enters our valleys," she said during one of their long conversations, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had witnessed both inexplicable tragedy and miraculous survival. "Our blood carries the blessings earned by ancestors who died protecting sacred places and holy customs. If we allow strangers to dilute these blessings with foreign blood, we lose the divine protection that has kept us alive when armies try to erase us from the earth. My daughters may suffer, but their children will be truly Kalash in ways that mixed blood can never achieve." From Dr. Qureshi's scientific perspective, the mathematics of survival painted an increasingly desperate picture. Her computer models calculated that the effective population size, the number of individuals successfully reproducing and contributing genetic material to future generations, had dropped to fewer than 800 people spread across 3 valleys. Inbreeding coefficients, statistical measures of how closely related parents were on average, climbed steadily with each generation as the available pool of genetically suitable partners continued shrinking. Population genetic simulations suggested that without significant intervention, genetic load would accumulate until fertility rates collapsed entirely, creating a death spiral where each generation produced fewer viable offspring than the one before. The community faced a future where their devotion to ancestral traditions would literally prevent them from having ancestors to honor. Yet the cultural logic of endogamy made perfect spiritual and practical sense within the Kalash worldview that had sustained them through hardships that would have broken less cohesive communities. Their gods were not abstract universal deities, but territorial spirits tied to specific landscapes, particular valleys, individual peaks, and springs that required intimate knowledge passed down through bloodlines blessed by centuries of faithful worship. In 1998, 15 years after Dr. Alam's initial census had first documented the demographic crisis threatening Kalash survival, an international NGO specializing in endangered indigenous communities arrived in the valleys with what they considered a carefully crafted solution to the genetic bottleneck that threatened to destroy Pakistan's last pagan tribe. The organization, founded by Swiss philanthropists who had made fortunes in pharmaceutical research, brought both scientific expertise and financial resources that could fund interventions on a scale that local communities could never afford. Their proposal was elegant in its apparent simplicity: establish formal marriage exchanges with other isolated mountain tribes whose genetic profiles would complement Kalash weaknesses, while sharing similar cultural adaptations to high-altitude life. The Hunza people, living just 200 miles north in valleys that remained snowbound for similar periods, practiced comparable agricultural techniques and maintained their own distinct cultural traditions while enjoying significantly greater genetic diversity thanks to historical connections with Silk Road trading networks. The NGO's representatives, led by Swiss anthropologist Dr. Eric Zimmerman, who had spent decades documenting disappearing cultures across Central Asia, presented their case with scientific precision that impressed educated Kalash, while mystifying traditional elders who lacked formal training in genetics or population biology. Computer simulations demonstrated that introducing just 20 carefully selected breeding pairs over 2 generations could reverse centuries of genetic drift while maintaining population sizes sufficient for cultural continuity. They offered comprehensive funding packages that included elaborate wedding ceremonies designed to honor both traditions, educational exchange programs that could preserve distinct cultural practices while promoting beneficial genetic mixing, and long-term medical monitoring to ensure healthy outcomes for children born from mixed marriages. The proposal included provisions for building schools that would teach Kalash children about their heritage while preparing them for success in Pakistan's modernizing economy. The offer split Kalash society along fault lines that had been building pressure for years as younger generations increasingly questioned practices that their grandparents considered sacred and immutable. Village elders convened unprecedented joint councils where representatives from all 3 valleys could debate the proposal in forums that gave equal voice to traditional authority figures and younger community members who had acquired modern educations. The arguments that filled those council meetings revealed fundamental disagreements about the nature of Kalash identity itself and the prices they were willing to pay for survival. Traditional leaders like Qazi Ghulam Murtaza, the elderly keeper of oral histories who could recite genealogies stretching back 20 generations, spoke with passionate conviction about the spiritual contamination that would inevitably result from abandoning practices that had earned divine protection. Our ancestors chose death rather than conversion when Muslim armies offered them safety in exchange for abandoning their faith, he declared during one particularly heated meeting, his white beard trembling with emotion that seemed to echo through the wooden meeting house like thunder. They died protecting the purity of our bloodlines because they understood that we are not simply another ethnic group that can be mixed with outsiders like barley mixed with wheat. We are the chosen guardians of gods who selected these specific valleys as their earthly homes. If we abandon the marriage rules they gave us, we become indistinguishable from any other people who call themselves whatever name seems convenient. Younger voices, particularly women who had lost multiple children to genetic disorders that clustered in certain family lines, offered equally compelling counterarguments that challenged assumptions their elders had never questioned. Shamim Bibi, whose 3 infant sons had died from the same rare heart defect that killed babies faster than traditional healers could diagnose the condition, stood before the council with tears streaming down her face as she challenged the theological framework that demanded such sacrifices. My grandmother tells me that the gods protect faithful believers who maintain proper customs and honor ancestral spirits, she said, her voice breaking with grief that had accumulated over years of watching tiny coffins disappear into frozen ground. But I have been faithful all my life. I have followed every purification ritual, observed every taboo, made offerings at every festival. And my babies still die because their blood carried the same poison that flows through their father's veins and mine. How can we worship gods who demand we sacrifice our children to prove our devotion? Dr. Qureshi found herself reluctantly thrust into the role of scientific advisor to a community grappling with questions that had no precedent in their oral traditions or cultural practices. After 18 months of agonizing debate that tested friendships, split families, and challenged assumptions that had remained unquestioned for generations, the Kalash reached a decision that satisfied no faction completely, but offered everyone something they could accept as preferable to the alternatives. In the spring of 2000, as wildflowers carpeted valley floors with colors that seemed designed to celebrate new beginnings, representatives from all 3 valleys signed what they called a consent charter, a document that established revolutionary new rules for marriage while preserving the core elements of their spiritual tradition that defined Kalash identity. The charter represented a masterpiece of cultural negotiation that balanced competing demands in ways that would have impressed diplomatic corps trained in international treaty-making. Any outsider wishing to marry into Kalash society would undergo a comprehensive 2-year apprenticeship that required mastering the intricate songs that preserved their oral history, understanding purity codes that govern daily behavior from food preparation to interactions with menstruating women, and participating in all major festivals until they could perform complex rituals with the same precision and spiritual commitment as lifelong community members. The apprenticeship program was designed to be genuinely challenging rather than a mere formality that ambitious outsiders could complete through superficial effort. Candidates had to demonstrate fluency in Kalashaman, the ancient language that preserved religious concepts with no equivalents in Urdu or English. They were required to memorize creation myths, genealogical chants, and seasonal ceremonies that took native speakers years to master completely. Most importantly, they had to win acceptance from elders who served as judges of spiritual authenticity and could reject candidates who seemed motivated by curiosity, romantic infatuation, or economic opportunity rather than genuine commitment to Kalash worldview. Children born from mixed marriages would be considered fully Kalash provided they were raised in the valleys according to traditional practices, initiated through appropriate ceremonies, and demonstrated the cultural knowledge expected of young people preparing for adult responsibilities. This provision addressed elders' concerns about diluting Kalash identity while ensuring that genetic diversity would benefit future generations who would face their own survival challenges. Equally important was the charter's commitment to keeping Kalash daughters connected to their ancestral communities, even as opportunities expanded beyond traditional roles. The elders established scholarship programs funded through NGO partnerships that allowed girls to receive moderate educations while maintaining cultural roots that previous generations of migrants had been forced to abandon. New schools built in each valley taught both Pakistani national curriculum and traditional Kalash knowledge, creating the first generation of young women who could navigate urban professional environments without losing their ability to participate in sacred ceremonies. The initial results exceeded the most optimistic predictions of both scientists and traditional leaders. Within 3 years, infant mortality rates dropped by 30% as genetic diversity slowly increased and harmful recessive alleles became less likely to pair in ways that produce fatal birth defects. More importantly for cultural continuity, the marriage apprenticeship program attracted idealistic young people from across South Asia who were genuinely committed to preserving Kalash traditions rather than simply exploiting exotic cultural practices for personal gratification. Hassan Ali, a university graduate from Chitral, whose engineering degree had prepared him for urban careers that seemed meaningless compared to the spiritual richness he discovered in Kalash valleys, spent 2 years learning to carve ritual objects, memorizing creation myths that connected human behavior to cosmic cycles, and participating in purification ceremonies that transformed his understanding of relationships between individual choices and community welfare. His wedding to Shaida Bibi became a celebration that lasted for a week, combining traditional Kalash festivities with innovations that honored both cultures while creating precedents for future mixed marriages. The festivals themselves evolved to include teaching circles where children could learn traditional skills alongside visitors who brought fresh perspectives on ancient practices while challenging their essential spiritual significance. Craft guilds were revived as young women found profitable markets for intricately embroidered textiles and carved wooden objects that tourists prized as authentic cultural artifacts rather than mass-produced souvenirs. By 2010, 12 years after the Consent Charter had fundamentally restructured Kalash marriage practices, the community had become an unlikely success story in the world of endangered cultures. But success had brought complications that no one had fully anticipated during the hopeful debates of the late 1990s. Health indicators showed dramatic improvements across all demographic categories that population geneticists monitored. Infant mortality had fallen to levels comparable with Pakistan's urban middle class, while birth rates remained high enough to ensure population stability for the first time in over a century. Genetic screening programs, administered by trained Kalash health workers who understood both modern medical concepts and traditional beliefs about spiritual purity, had identified 2 serious recessive disorders early enough for voluntary counseling to reduce their frequency by 60% over a single generation. Young couples could make informed decisions about reproduction while maintaining the spiritual framework that gave their choices meaning within traditional worldview, creating a synthesis between scientific knowledge and ancestral wisdom that served as a model for other endangered communities. The economic benefits were equally impressive and far-reaching. Craft guilds that had been revived to preserve traditional skills evolved into sophisticated cooperatives that marketed Kalash textiles, wood carvings, and preserved foods to international buyers willing to pay premium prices for authentic cultural products. Tourism revenue provided funding for infrastructure improvements that made valley life more comfortable without destroying its essential character. Solar panels powered LED lights that illuminated evening festivals, while improved trails made emergency medical evacuation possible during winter months when avalanches had once meant certain death for anyone requiring urgent care. Young people who might once have migrated permanently to cities found meaningful economic opportunities within their ancestral homeland, creating the first generation in decades that could choose to remain in the valleys without condemning themselves to poverty or isolation from modern amenities. The combination of cultural preservation and economic development attracted international attention as a successful model for indigenous community survival in an increasingly globalized world. But prosperity brought challenges that tested the community's ability to control the terms of their engagement with the outside world. Social media platforms discovered the Kalash around 2015 when viral videos of their colorful festivals attracted millions of views from audiences hungry for exotic content that could provide brief escapes from urban monotony. Suddenly, valleys that had remained virtually unknown to outsiders for centuries found themselves invaded by Instagram influencers, travel bloggers, and curiosity seekers who treated ancient religious ceremonies like entertainment designed specifically for their consumption and social media profiles. The flood of visitors created unprecedented economic opportunities, but also cultural stresses that tested the adaptability that had enabled Kalash survival through previous crises. Hotels and restaurants appeared seemingly overnight, operated by Pakistani entrepreneurs who had little understanding of Kalash values but abundant enthusiasm for profiting from their uniqueness. Traditional festivals became performance spectacles where genuine religious devotion competed with commercialized displays designed to satisfy tourist expectations rather than honor spiritual obligations. More subtle but equally troubling were the ways external attention began reshaping Kalash self-perception and cultural practices. Younger people increasingly described their traditions using language borrowed from tourism marketing rather than the spiritual terminology their grandparents employed. Ancient rituals that had evolved organically over centuries became standardized performances that could be reliably delivered according to tour group schedules, losing the spontaneous elements that had made them spiritually meaningful for participants. The genetic counseling programs, while medically successful beyond anyone's expectations, created new social tensions around reproductive topics that previous generations had left entirely to divine will and traditional matchmaking. Families who discovered they carried identical recessive genes faced difficult decisions about marriage and childbearing that required them to balance scientific knowledge against spiritual beliefs in ways their ancestors never had to consider. 25 years after Dr. Alam's first census revealed the full scope of the genetic crisis threatening Kalash survival, the community stands as a complex testament to the possibility of cultural preservation through carefully managed adaptation rather than rigid adherence to practices that circumstances had rendered unsustainable. Their population has stabilized at approximately 6,000 people, still small by any demographic measure, but large enough to maintain the critical mass necessary for their elaborate festival cycles, intricate social institutions, and the intergenerational transmission of knowledge that defines any living culture. The question of whether they remain authentically Kalash in ways their ancestors would recognize has no simple answer that satisfies either purists or modernizers completely. Their language continues evolving, incorporating vocabulary from Urdu and English alongside ancient words that linguists are still working to document before they disappear from active use. Their religious practices blend traditional offerings to mountain gods with voluntary genetic counseling that would have been incomprehensible to earlier generations, creating hybrid forms of decision-making that honor both spiritual and scientific sources of wisdom. Their young people navigate between smartphones and sacred groves with fluidity that suggests culture is not a museum piece preserved under glass, but a living algorithm that adapts to changing circumstances while maintaining core values that define group identity across generations. Perhaps most significantly, they have begun exporting their hard-won wisdom about sustainable cultural adaptation to other endangered communities facing similar choices between cultural purity and biological survival. Delegations from Tibet, Papua New Guinea, the Amazon rainforest, and Arctic communities visit Kalash valleys to study how ancient traditions can incorporate modern knowledge without losing their essential spiritual significance. The people who once seemed destined for extinction within a few generations have become teachers whose experience offers hope for indigenous communities worldwide that globalization doesn't necessarily require cultural homogenization. On quiet nights when tourism season ends and the valleys return to their ancestral rhythms undisturbed by camera flashes and tour guide commentary, visitors can still witness scenes that connect directly to communities' deepest spiritual roots. Cedar shrines stand silhouetted against star-filled skies while drums echo through mountain corridors that have carried the same rhythms for millennia. Women gather around cooking fires where newborn babies sleep peacefully in traditional blankets, their steady breathing serving as living proof that culture doesn't survive by freezing itself in time, but by choosing wisely what to protect and what to share with a changing world. The Kalash remind us that survival often requires the courage to change the things we can control while finding ways to preserve what matters most about who we are and where we come from. Their story raises questions that extend far beyond their mountain valleys. Should any community engineer its own survival through practices that would have horrified their ancestors? Can tradition remain meaningful if it adapts to circumstances those who created it never imagined? How much change can cultural identity absorb before it transforms into something entirely different? Tell us in the comments what you think about the impossible choices the Kalash made, whether you believe they found the right balance between preservation and adaptation. And subscribe if you want more hidden histories that reveal how communities like this one navigate the space between honoring the past and ensuring the future.